The crackling fire mingled with the freezing silence of the night. Outside, the wind howled through the trees, carrying the scent of blood and smoke. On the cave floor, a man lay motionless, his body covered in dried blood, empty eyes reflecting the trembling flames. Behind him, shadows moved, and a hoarse voice whispered, "He has returned to face what he denied for so long." The air seemed heavy, the past about to emerge from darkness. What secrets lay hidden in this cave? The darkest secret of the Berserker. 24 hours earlier, Sigurd Haraldsson walked through the forest near the village of Skjoldheim. His body bore the marks of years of battles, his face hardened by pain and frost. At 32, he was a feared warrior, a berserker who had sworn loyalty to his clan, but also a man trapped in shadows few dared to acknowledge. His days consisted of silence and contained fury, divided between work at the forge and solitary training sessions where he attempted to tame the wild beast within. The late autumn air bit at his exposed skin as he moved silently through the trees. Winter was approaching, and the first frost had already painted the landscape in silvery white. Sigurd's breath formed clouds before his face, disappearing into the mist that clung to the ancient pines. The forest was a sanctuary of sorts for him. Here, away from judging eyes, he could breathe without the weight of expectations pressing down on his chest. His calloused fingers absently traced the wolf-shaped iron pendant hanging from his neck, a gift from his father before the raid that had claimed the old man's life. 13 winters had passed since that day, yet the memory remained as sharp as a freshly honed blade. The pendant was cold against his skin, a constant reminder of who he was meant to be. Strong, ruthless, unwavering, a true son of the North. The forest floor was carpeted with fallen leaves, dampened by morning dew and rotting into the earth. Each step produced a soft, wet sound that joined the distant calls of ravens. Sigurd moved with the practiced stealth of a hunter, though today he carried no bow, only the broad-bladed axe strapped to his back, a warrior's tool, not a provider's. His mind wandered to the dreams that had plagued him for weeks now, visions of a cave, of blood on stone walls, of a younger version of himself standing with trembling hands. He paused at a small clearing, looking up at the sky visible through the canopy of branches. Gray clouds moved swiftly overhead, promising snow before nightfall. Something felt different today, a tension in the air that had nothing to do with the coming storm. The hairs on his arms stood on end beneath his woolen tunic and leather armor. His instincts, honed through countless battles, whispered warnings he couldn't quite comprehend. It was then that he heard it, a sound so out of place in the wilderness that it stopped him mid-stride. A muffled sob, barely audible over the rustle of leaves in the wind. Human pain, raw and unmistakable. Sigurd turned slowly, his hand instinctively moving to the haft of his axe. The sound came again, weaker this time, from a dense thicket to his right. Moving cautiously, he approached the source of the sound. The undergrowth parted to reveal a small hollow formed by the exposed roots of an ancient oak. There, curled into herself like a wounded animal, lay a young woman. Her black hair hung in tangled strands around a face marked by exhaustion and fear. What remained of her clothing, once a simple linen tunic and woolen cloak, was torn and soiled. Fresh bruises bloomed on her pale skin, visible even in the dim forest light. Sigurd stood frozen, caught between clan law and something deeper, something that stirred in his chest like a forgotten ember. The code of honor was clear. Outsiders were not to be trusted, especially not those who might bring the wrath of rival clans down upon Skjoldheim. To aid her would risk everything, his standing, his honor, perhaps even the safety of his people. And yet, her eyes. When she sensed his presence and looked up, Sigurd found himself staring into eyes green as spring leaves, wide with terror, but holding a spark of defiance that refused to be extinguished. Something in that gaze spoke to him, reached past the hardened shell he had built around himself over years of battle and loss. "Who are you?" he asked, his deep voice softer than he intended. His hand, which had moments before been ready to draw his weapon, now hung uncertainly at his side. She flinched at his words, pressing herself further into the hollow of roots. A moment passed before she found her voice, cracked and barely above a whisper. "Solveig," she managed, her accent marking her as someone from the coastal settlements to the east. "Please, don't take me back." Back. The word hung between them like a drawn blade. Sigurd understood immediately. She was a fugitive, running from someone powerful enough to inspire such terror. His mind raced through the possibilities. The eastern settlements were controlled by Ulfrik Gudmundsson's clan, traditional rivals to Skjoldheim. If she had fled from them— "Ulfrik's people hold you?" he asked, keeping his voice level despite the implications churning in his mind. She nodded once, a barely perceptible movement. A drop of blood traced a path from a cut on her temple down her cheek, mingling with tears, before disappearing into the collar of her torn garment. "They will come for me," she whispered, a statement of certainty rather than fear. "They always do." Sigurd felt the weight of decision press down upon him like a physical burden. To turn away would be simple, the safe choice, the choice any reasonable man would make. Ulfrik was not known for mercy toward those who interfered with his affairs. The clan elder, Thorvald, would counsel against involvement, would remind Sigurd of his duty to protect Skjoldheim above all else. And yet, as he stood there in the gathering gloom of the forest, Sigurd felt something shift within him. The beast that lurked beneath his skin, the berserker fury he worked so hard to contain, stirred not with bloodlust, but with a strange protective instinct he scarcely recognized. "Can you walk?" he asked finally, his decision made, even as the rational part of his mind screamed warnings. Surprise flickered across Solveig's face, followed quickly by suspicion. "Why would you help me?" A fair question, one Sigurd wasn't sure he could answer even to himself. He looked away, toward the darkening sky. Winter comes. Even wolves don't leave the wounded to die in the snow. Not the whole truth, perhaps, but enough of it. He extended his hand, calloused and scarred from years at the forge, toward her. For a long moment, Solveig simply stared at it, weighing her limited options. Then, with the deliberate movement of someone expecting pain, she reached out and placed her smaller hand in his. Her fingers were ice cold, and as Sigurd helped her to her feet, he felt how she trembled. From cold, from fear, from exhaustion, he couldn't tell. She swayed dangerously, and without thinking, he steadied her with a hand on her shoulder. Even through the torn fabric of her tunic, he could feel the heat of fresh welts. Someone had beaten her, and recently. Something dark and primal stirred in Sigurd's chest at this realization. The berserker rage, always simmering beneath the surface, threatened to rise. He forced it down, focusing instead on the immediate needs of the woman before him. "My home lies beyond that ridge," he said, gesturing northward. "It's not much, but there's fire and shelter." Solveig nodded weakly, taking a tentative step forward. Her legs buckled almost immediately, and Sigurd moved without hesitation, catching her before she fell. Up close, he could see how truly exhausted she was. Dark circles beneath her eyes, lips cracked from dehydration, the fine tremor of someone pushed beyond endurance. "I can't," she began, frustration evident in her voice. "Then I'll carry you," Sigurd said simply, and before she could protest, he lifted her into his arms. She weighed hardly anything at all, a fact that stirred an unexpected pang of concern in his chest. As he began the journey back to his cabin, Solveig stiff and uncertain in his arms, Sigurd felt the first snowflakes of winter touch his face. The storm was coming faster than he'd anticipated. Soon their tracks would be covered, hidden from any who might follow. A small mercy, perhaps, but one he would take. What he couldn't know, as he carried his burden through the darkening forest, was that this simple act of compassion would set in motion events that would force him to confront the very past he had spent years trying to escape. The cave of his nightmares waited, and with it the darkest secret of his soul. Sigurd's cabin stood apart from the main village of Skoldheim, nestled against the base of a rocky hill and surrounded by ancient pines. He had built it himself after returning from his last raid 3 summers ago, choosing solitude over the communal longhouses where most of the clan dwelled. The villagers had understood, or at least pretended to. Berserkers were respected for their battle prowess, but often kept at arm's length, their fury both weapon and curse. By the time they reached the small clearing where the cabin stood, the snow was falling steadily. Solveig had remained silent throughout the journey, her body gradually relaxing against his chest as exhaustion overcame fear. Now, as the wooden structure came into view, she stirred slightly. "Are we alone here?" she asked, her voice small against the growing whisper of snowfall. "Yes," Sigurd replied, understanding her concern. "The village lies beyond those hills. None will come here, especially not in this weather." Relief flickered across her features, quickly replaced by wariness as he carried her toward the door. Trust would not come easily to someone who had clearly suffered at the hands of others. Sigurd couldn't blame her for that. The interior of the cabin was simple but sturdy. A single room with a stone hearth at its center, a sleeping platform covered in furs along one wall, a rough-hewn table and chair, and various tools of daily life hanging from the rafters or stored in wooden chests. A small fire still smoldered in the hearth from morning, its embers casting a dull red glow across the packed earth floor. Sigurd gently set Solveig down on the edge of the sleeping platform, then moved to revive the fire. His large hands worked with surprising deftness, adding kindling and small logs until flames leapt upward, bathing the cabin in golden light and blessed warmth. Only then did he turn back to his unexpected guest. In the firelight, the extent of her injuries became more apparent. Bruises in various stages of healing marked her arms and face. A particularly vicious cut above her right eye had crusted with dried blood, and the way she held herself spoke of pain in her ribs or back. Anger stirred again in Sigurd's chest, but he kept his expression neutral as he moved to a wooden chest near the hearth. "I have herbs," he said, rummaging through the contents until he found what he sought, a small leather pouch filled with dried plants. "For your wounds." Solveig watched him with those alert green eyes, tracking his movements as he retrieved a clay bowl and filled it with water from a bucket near the door.
He placed these items on the table along with a clean cloth, then stepped back, giving her space. "I won't harm you," he said.
It wasn't an elaborate promise or oath, just a statement of fact delivered in his deep, steady voice. Something in his tone or manner must have convinced her, for Solveig nodded slowly. "Thank you," she whispered, the words clearly unfamiliar on her tongue, as if gratitude had become a forgotten language. As Sigurd prepared a simple poultice from the herbs, knowledge gleaned from Freya, the village healer who had tended his wounds after countless battles. He observed Solveig from the corner of his eye. Despite her exhaustion, she remained vigilant, her gaze darting occasionally to the door or windows. One hand clutched at something hidden beneath the tattered remains of her tunic, something that seemed to provide her comfort. "Your wounds need tending," he said finally, approaching with the bowl of herb-infused water and clean cloth. He set them beside her on the sleeping platform, then retreated a respectful distance. "Can you manage, or—" The unfinished question hung in the air between them. Solveig considered for a moment, then reached for the cloth. "I can," she said, with a hint of pride that spoke volumes about her character. Sigurd nodded and turned away, busying himself with preparing a simple meal: dried meat, hard bread, and the last of his autumn honey. Behind him he could hear the soft sounds of water being wrung from cloth, the occasional sharp intake of breath as she cleaned her wounds. He allowed her this privacy, this small dignity in what had clearly been a time of great indignity. When he turned back, bowl of food in hand, Solveig had cleaned the worst of the blood from her face and arms. The cloth in the bowl beside her had turned a pale pink. She looked marginally better, though exhaustion still etched deep lines around her eyes and mouth. "Eat," he said, offering the wooden bowl. "Then rest. We'll speak more when you've regained your strength." Solveig accepted the bowl with hands that trembled slightly. As she did, the object she had been clutching slipped into view, a small amulet in the shape of a raven, broken nearly in half but held together by a thin leather cord. The sight of it triggered something in Sigurd's memory, but the thought slipped away before he could grasp it. He watched as she ate slowly, methodically, like someone accustomed to making meager portions last. When she had finished, he took the bowl without comment and replaced it with a cup of water. She drank deeply, then settled back against the wall, her eyes growing heavy despite her obvious attempts to remain alert. "Sleep," Sigurd said quietly. "None will find you here tonight." "And tomorrow?" she asked, the question laden with unspoken fears. Sigurd looked toward the small window, where snow continued to fall in the gathering darkness. "Tomorrow we'll see what the gods have woven for us," he answered truthfully. "For now, rest." He moved to the opposite side of the hearth, settling on a fur placed directly on the floor. From this position he could watch both Solveig and the door, a warrior's habit that had saved his life more than once. As the fire crackled and shadows danced across the log walls, Sigurd found himself studying the woman who had so unexpectedly entered his life. There was strength in her, despite her current state. He could see it in the set of her jaw, the way she had refused to beg or plead. Whatever Ulfrik's people had done to her, they hadn't broken her spirit. That, more than anything, earned his respect. As Solveig finally surrendered to sleep, her breathing deepening and her features relaxing, Sigurd remained vigilant. Outside, the wind picked up, driving snow against the walls of the cabin with a sound like distant whispers. The storm had arrived in full force, isolating them from the world beyond. In the dancing firelight, Sigurd's thoughts turned to what he had done and what might come of it.
By morning, Solveig's disappearance would be known.
Ulfrik was not a man to let anyone escape his grasp, especially not a woman he had marked as his own. Questions would be asked, hunters sent out, and if they traced her to Skjoldheim, to Sigurd. He closed his eyes briefly, feeling the weight of consequence settle around his shoulders like a familiar cloak. The clan elder would not approve. The fragile peace between the settlements might shatter. And yet, looking at the sleeping woman across the fire, Sigurd could not bring himself to regret his choice. Whatever came with the dawn, he would face it. For now, in the stillness of the storm-wrapped night, he allowed himself a moment of quiet certainty that he had done what was right, not what was easy. It was a small comfort against the darkness that gathered both outside the cabin and within his own troubled mind. Dawn broke gray and subdued, the storm having passed in the night to leave behind a world transformed by snow. Sigurd woke instantly, as was his habit, eyes scanning the cabin before he even fully rose to consciousness. Solveig still slept on the platform, curled beneath the furs he had placed over her in the night when the fire had burned low. Her face, relaxed in sleep, looked younger, the lines of fear and pain temporarily erased. He rose silently, adding wood to the rekindled fire before moving to the door. Outside, the world was hushed, blanketed in white that reflected the pale morning light. Snow had drifted against the cabin walls, and the path to the village was completely obscured. A good sign. It would make tracking difficult, if not impossible, for anyone searching for Solveig. Sigurd's breath formed clouds in the cold air as he surveyed his surroundings. No footprints marred the pristine snow, no smoke rose from any direction save his own chimney. They were alone, at least for now. He gathered an armful of firewood from the covered stack beside the cabin and returned inside, closing the door quietly behind him.
The sound, soft as it was, roused Solveig. She woke with a start, eyes flying open in momentary panic before focusing on Sigurd. Recognition dawned, followed by the wary alertness he had noted the previous day. "The storm has passed," he said by way of greeting, placing the wood beside the hearth. "How do you fare this morning?" Solveig pushed herself up slowly, wincing as she did so. The bruises on her face had darkened overnight, a rainbow of purple and yellow against her pale skin. "I live," she answered simply, "thanks to you." Sigurd nodded, accepting her words without need for elaboration. He moved to prepare a morning meal, porridge made from stored grain, sweetened with the last of his honey. As he worked, he felt Solveig's eyes on him, assessing, calculating. "Why did you help me?" she asked finally, voicing the question that had clearly troubled her through the night. "You know nothing of me." Sigurd paused in his work, considering his answer carefully. The truth was complex, tied to memories and feelings he rarely examined. "I know enough," he said at last. "I know suffering when I see it. I know what it is to flee something that haunts you." He turned to face her fully, wooden spoon still in hand. "What I don't know is why Ulfrik Gudmundsson's people held you, or why you risked death in the forest to escape them." Solveig's hand went instinctively to the broken raven amulet that hung around her neck. "This was my mother's," she said, her voice taking on a distant quality. "She was a seer in our village before Ulfrik's raid 3 summers ago." She looked up, meeting Sigurd's gaze directly. "They killed the men, took the women and children. My mother, she fought back. Ulfrik broke her amulet before her eyes, then broke her spirit in ways I won't speak of. She died last winter, but not before teaching me the old ways, the true sight." Understanding dawned on Sigurd. Seers were valued in some clans, feared in others.
Ulfrik, with his devotion to the war aspects of their gods, would see such women as both useful and dangerous. "You have the sight?" he asked, his voice carefully neutral. "Some small measure of it," Solveig admitted. "Enough that Ulfrik wanted to keep me close, to use my dreams to guide his raids." Her fingers tightened around the amulet. I refused. The visions aren't tools for his ambition. They're sacred, meant to guide and protect, not to bring death. She fell silent, the effort of speaking having drained what little color had returned to her face. Sigurd finished preparing the porridge, dividing it between 2 wooden bowls. He handed one to Solveig, then settled on the floor near the fire with his own portion. "Ulfrik is not known for accepting refusal," he said, after they had eaten in silence for a few moments. "No," Solveig agreed, a bitter smile touching her lips. "He is not. His men tried to persuade me to reconsider." The word persuade carried the weight of all the bruises and wounds visible on her body. Anger flared in Sigurd's chest, hot and familiar. The berserker part of him, never truly silent, stirred at the thought of such treatment. He had seen the aftermath of raids, had participated in his share of violence, but the deliberate breaking of spirit, that was something that stirred a particular revulsion in him. "How did you escape?" he asked, forcing his voice to remain calm. "One of the thralls, a woman from the eastern islands, helped me," Solveig replied. "She paid for it with her life, I think." Pain flashed across her features, guilt mingling with grief. "I ran for 3 days before you found me. I had hoped to reach the coastal settlements before winter, perhaps find passage on a trading ship." Sigurd considered this information carefully. The coastal settlements were at least 5 days' journey on foot in good weather, an impossible distance for someone in Solveig's condition, with winter closing in. And even if she reached them, there would be few ships willing to sail now, with ice forming in the fjords and the sea turning treacherous. "You're safe here for now," he said, though both knew it was only a partial truth. No one was truly safe with Ulfrik seeking them. "Rest, regain your strength. When you're able to travel, we'll consider what path lies ahead." Solveig studied him, those green eyes penetrating in their intensity. "You risk much by sheltering me. Your clan?" "My concern, not yours," Sigurd interrupted, more sharply than he intended. He softened his tone before continuing. "Skjoldheim has no quarrel with Ulfrik at present, but neither are we bound to him. What happens under my roof is my affair." It was a bold statement, one that stretched the truth of clan politics, but Sigurd found he meant it nonetheless. Something about Solveig's quiet dignity, her refusal to surrender her principles, even under torture, resonated with a part of himself he had long suppressed. As they finished their meal in silence, Sigurd's thoughts turned to the village. He would need to go there soon, for supplies, but also to gauge what news might have reached them. If Ulfrik had already sent messengers or search parties, it would be better to know sooner rather than later. "I must go to the village today," he said, rising to his feet. "You'll be safe here, but bar the door after I leave. Open it for none but me." Solveig nodded, though fear flashed briefly across her face at the thought of being left alone. "How will I know it's you?" she asked practically. "I'll knock 3 times, pause, then twice more," Sigurd replied, impressed by her foresight. "If anyone else comes, remain silent. They'll believe the cabin empty with no smoke from the hearth." He gestured to the fire. "Let it die down while I'm gone." He moved to a chest in the corner, retrieving a clean tunic and leggings. "These will be too large, but they're warm and whole," he said. offering them to Solveig. "Your current garments are hardly garments at all anymore," she finished with unexpected dry humor. A ghost of a smile touched her lips as she accepted the clothing. "Thank you, Sigurd Haraldsson. Your kindness will not be forgotten." The use of his full name startled him. He hadn't introduced himself with his patronymic. Noting his surprise, Solveig's smile deepened slightly. "The runes on your axe haft," she explained, gesturing to where the weapon rested against the wall. "Haraldsson, and the villagers call you Sigurd Wolfi. I heard whispers of you even in Ulfrik's settlement, the Berserker who returned from the southern raids with a wolf's gaze." Sigurd felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter air. His reputation had spread further than he realized. It wasn't surprising that Ulfrik's people knew of him, but the thought was unsettling nonetheless. If they knew of him, they might look to him if Solveig's trail led to Skjoldheim. "Rest," he said again, gathering his heavy cloak and axe. "I'll return before nightfall." As he stepped out into the snow-covered world, pulling the door firmly shut behind him, Sigurd couldn't shake the feeling that he had set foot on a path from which there would be no easy return. The peaceful isolation he had carved for himself these past years seemed suddenly fragile, threatened not just by Ulfrik's potential wrath, but by something within himself. Something that had woken at the sight of Solveig's defiant green eyes and broken raven amulet. The walk to Skjoldheim took longer than usual, the deep snow making each step laborious. By the time the smoke from the village hearth fires came into view, the sun had risen fully, casting long blue shadows across the white landscape. Sigurd paused at the edge of the settlement, observing the scene before him. Life continued as normal, it seemed. Women moved between buildings carrying baskets or water buckets. Men worked at maintenance tasks or gathered in small groups. Children darted about in the snow, their laughter carrying clearly in the cold air. No signs of unusual activity, no strangers or messengers that he could see. Sigurd pulled his hood lower and entered the village, nodding acknowledgments to those who greeted him. As the berserker of the clan, he occupied an unusual position, respected for his battle prowess, yet slightly feared for the same reason. Most villagers treated him with a careful deference, including him in community matters while respecting his desire for solitude. His first stop was the forge, where he exchanged brief words with Gunnar, the blacksmith, about repairs needed for his axe. Next came the storehouse, where he traded furs he had trapped earlier in the season for supplies, flour, dried meat, salt. Throughout these interactions, he listened carefully to the conversations around him, alert for any mention of Ulfrik or strangers in the area. It was at the mead hall, where he stopped to warm himself briefly, that he first heard whispers that concerned him. Thorvald, the clan elder, sat with several council members near the central hearth. Their voices were low, but Sigurd's keen hearing caught fragments of their discussion. Messengers from Ulfrik's settlement. Woman fled, valuable to him. Offering silver for her return. Threatens consequences if any shelter her. Sigurd kept his expression neutral as he sipped from a horn of mead offered by one of the serving women. So, Ulfrik had acted quickly. Messengers must have been dispatched immediately after Solveig's escape, traveling through the storm to reach neighboring settlements. The offer of silver spoke to her value to Ulfrik, but the implied threat revealed even more. He was considering how best to learn additional details when Thorvald himself approached, settling heavily onto the bench beside him. The elder was in his 60th winter, his once red beard now more gray than flame, but his eyes remained sharp as a hawk's.
"Sigurd," he greeted, his voice carrying the gravelly quality of one who had shouted many battle commands in his youth. "Not often we see you in the hall these days." "The storm brought needs," Sigurd replied simply. "My stores run low." Thorvald nodded, studying him with those penetrating eyes. "Strange weather brings strange tidings," he said after a moment. "Messengers arrived this morning from Ulfrik's settlement." Sigurd took another drink of mead, using the moment to compose his response. "What business brings them through such conditions?" he asked, feigning only mild interest. "A fugitive," Thorvald said bluntly. "A woman, young, dark-haired, with green eyes. A seer, they claim, who stole valuable knowledge before fleeing. Ulfrik offers silver for her return, or information leading to her capture." The elder paused, watching Sigurd carefully. "They say she may seek shelter in neighboring settlements. Ulfrik requests that we report any strangers immediately." The emphasis on requests told Sigurd all he needed to know about the true nature of the message. Ulfrik's requests carried the implicit threat of consequences if denied. "A seer," Sigurd commented, keeping his tone neutral. "Valuable indeed." Thorvald agreed, though one wonders why a valued seer would flee, risking death in winter. The elder's eyes narrowed slightly. "Unless Ulfrik's hospitality left something to be desired." It was as close as Thorvald would come to openly criticizing a neighboring chieftain. The politics between settlements were delicate, especially with winter closing in, and all communities more dependent on trade and mutual aid.
"You've been in the forest these past days," Thorvald continued, his tone conversational but his gaze intent. "Hunting, I presume?" The question hung between them, laden with unspoken meaning. Sigurd met the elder's eyes directly. "The forest offers solitude," he replied carefully, "and occasionally guidance for those who are lost." Understanding passed between them, swift and silent as a raven's shadow. Thorvald nodded once, then rose to his feet. "Winter is a time of waiting," he said, loud enough for those nearby to hear, "of tending to one's own hearth and concerns." He clasped Sigurd's shoulder briefly. "May your fires burn warm, Wolf-Eye, in these cold times." With that he returned to the council members, leaving Sigurd to consider the implications of their exchange. Thorvald had not asked directly if Sigurd had encountered the fugitive. More had Sigurd admitted to sheltering her. But a message had been conveyed nonetheless. Thorvald would not actively seek Solveig, but neither could he openly protect her if Ulfrik pressed the matter. Sigurd finished his mead and rose to leave. As he did, he noticed several villagers watching him with curious expressions. Word traveled quickly in small communities, and his unusual appearance in the village on this particular day would not go unremarked. He would need to be cautious in the days ahead. The journey back to his cabin seemed longer, his pack of supplies a physical reminder of the burden he had taken on. The sun was already beginning its early winter descent when he finally approached the clearing, noting with approval that no smoke rose from his chimney. Solveig had heeded his warning. He knocked as arranged, 3 times, paused, twice more, and waited. After a moment he heard the sound of the bar being lifted, and the door opened to reveal Solveig, draped in his oversized tunic, her face tense until she confirmed his identity. "You return later than I expected," she said, stepping back to allow him entry. "I feared." "Ulfrik's messengers reached Skoldheim this morning," Sigurd confirmed, setting down his pack and removing his snow-covered cloak. "They seek a dark-haired woman with green eyes, a thief of valuable knowledge, they claim."
Solveig's face hardened at this description. "Thief? I stole nothing but my own freedom." "And your mother's gift," Sigurd pointed out, gesturing to the raven amulet, "which Ulfrik considers his property, no doubt." She touched the broken amulet protectively. "This was never his to take or keep?" Sigurd nodded, understanding her fierce attachment to this last connection to her mother. He began unpacking the supplies, arranging them on the small table. "Thorvald, our elder, knows, or suspects," he said after a moment. "He will not actively seek you, but neither can he protect you if Ulfrik's men come searching in earnest." Solveig sank onto the edge of the sleeping platform, her momentary defiance giving way to weary resignation. "Then I've brought danger to your door, as I feared." She looked up at him, those green eyes troubled. "I should leave, continue north, perhaps." "And die in the snow," Sigurd interrupted flatly. "Winter has come in truth now. The northern passes will already be blocked." He rekindled the fire, watching the flames catch and grow before continuing. "For now, you remain here. When your strength returns, we will consider other paths." Solveig studied him, her expression unreadable. "Why do you risk so much for a stranger, Sigurd Wolfeye? What do you gain from this?" It was a fair question, one that Sigurd had been asking himself since he first found her in the forest. The answer, when it came to him, was surprisingly simple. "Perhaps it is not about gain," he said quietly. "Perhaps it is about choosing, for once, to be the man I wish to be, rather than the man others expect me to be." The words, once spoken, hung in the air between them, more revealing than he had intended. Solveig's expression softened, and for just a moment Sigurd glimpsed something beyond the fear and wariness that had defined her since their meeting, a genuine warmth that transformed her face. "Then I am fortunate indeed," she said softly, "to have been found by such a man." The moment stretched between them, fragile and unexpected, before Sigurd turned away, uncomfortable with the sudden intimacy. He busied himself with practical matters, preparing a meal, arranging his supplies, checking that the cabin was secure against the growing cold as night fell once more. But as they shared a simple meal by firelight, something had shifted in the atmosphere of the small cabin. A tentative trust had begun to form, a connection forged not just by circumstance, but by a mutual recognition of something kindred in their spirits. It was a dangerous thing, perhaps, this growing bond, but like his decision in the forest, Sigurd found he could not bring himself to regret it. Outside, the night deepened, stars appearing in the clear sky left by the storm. The world was quiet, peaceful. But in the settlements to the east, Sigurd knew, Ulfrik Gudmundsson would be growing impatient for news of his escaped seer. The peace, like the fresh snow blanketing the forest, was beautiful but temporary. Beneath it, the earth remained hard and unyielding, waiting for the thaw that would reveal all that had been hidden. 3 days passed in a strange, suspended peace. The snow continued to fall intermittently, further isolating Sigurd's cabin from the village and any potential searchers. Solveig's strength returned gradually. She moved with less pain, ate with increasing appetite, and the worst of her bruises began to fade from angry purple to sickly yellow. During this time, they established a careful routine.
Sigurd would hunt in the nearby forest during daylight hours, returning with rabbits or occasionally a deer. Solveig tended the fire and prepared simple meals, her capable hands making quick work of the limited ingredients available to them. In the evenings, they shared the quiet companionship of those who have survived hardship. Not many words, but a comfortable silence punctuated by the occasional story or observation.
Sigurd learned that Solveig had been 16 when Ulfrik's raid destroyed her village, old enough to understand the horrors she witnessed, young enough to still feel the full weight of their trauma. Her mother, the seer, had protected her by claiming Solveig lacked the gift, a deception maintained until the older woman's death the previous winter. Only then had Ulfrik discovered Solveig's abilities, when grief-induced visions revealed her true nature. For her part, Solveig discovered that beneath Sigurd's taciturn exterior lay a man of unexpected depth. He spoke rarely of battles or glory, unlike most warriors she had known. Instead, when he did speak, it was of the forest, of the crafting of weapons as an art rather than just tools of death, of the old stories his grandmother had taught him, tales that honored wisdom as much as valor. On the fourth morning, everything changed. Sigurd woke before dawn, as was his habit, to find Solveig already awake, sitting rigid by the dying fire. Her face was pale, her eyes wide and unfocused in a way that sent a chill down his spine. "They come," she whispered, her voice distant, as if speaking from somewhere far beyond the cabin walls, "with torches and hatred, with blades thirsty for blood." Sigurd moved to her side immediately, recognizing the signs of a vision. "Solveig," he said firmly, placing a hand on her shoulder, "come back, tell me what you see." She blinked slowly, her gaze gradually focusing on his face. "Ulfrik," she said, her voice steadier but filled with dread. "He leads them himself.
20 warriors, maybe more. They ride for Skjoldheim." Alarm coursed through Sigurd. "When?" "Today. They left at first light yesterday. The snow slows them, but—" She shuddered. "They bring dogs. Hunting dogs that can track a scent from miles." Sigurd's mind raced. If what Solveig saw was true, and he had no reason to doubt her gift, they had perhaps hours before Ulfrik's party reached the village. From there, it wouldn't take long for the dogs to pick up Solveig's trail, especially if they had something of hers to scent from. "We need to leave," he said decisively, already moving to gather essentials. "Now, before they reach Skjoldheim." "And go where?" Solveig asked, fear evident in her voice despite her efforts to control it. "The passes are closed. The coastal settlements would turn us over immediately." Sigurd paused in his preparations, a grim determination settling over his features. "There is a place," he said reluctantly, "a cave, high in the eastern ridge. Few know of it, and those who do avoid it. They say it's cursed." "Cursed?" Solveig repeated, studying his face carefully. "Yet you would go there?" Something dark flickered in Sigurd's eyes, gone so quickly Solveig might have imagined it. "It's our best chance," he said simply. "The entrance is difficult to find, especially in winter, and no dog will follow our scent there." The certainty in his voice raised questions, but Solveig knew better than to press. Whatever connection this cave had to Sigurd's past, it clearly troubled him deeply. That he would return there for her safety spoke volumes. They prepared swiftly. Food, water skins, extra furs for warmth, a small cooking pot, Sigurd's axe and hunting knife. As Solveig gathered these items into packs, Sigurd knelt by the hearth, carefully removing a loose stone from the floor beneath. From this hidden space, he withdrew a small leather pouch that clinked softly as he tucked it into his belt.
"Silver," he explained, seeing Solveig's questioning look. "Enough to buy passage on a ship when spring comes, if we survive that long." The casual mention of their possible death should have frightened her, but Solveig found herself oddly calm. After all she had endured, the prospect of dying free seemed preferable to living as Ulfrik's captive seer, forced to guide his raids and witness more suffering. By the time the first pale light of dawn crept over the horizon, they were ready. Sigurd scattered the ashes of their fire, ensuring no heat remained that might be detected. He moved their few dishes, rearranged the furs on his sleeping platform, creating the appearance that he had simply gone hunting for a few days, a normal occurrence that would raise no immediate suspicions if villagers came looking for him. "One last thing," he said, turning to Solveig. From a small wooden box he produced a knife, smaller than his hunting blade, but well crafted, with a bone handle carved with protective runes. "Take this. Keep it hidden, but close." Solveig accepted the weapon, testing its weight in her hand, before concealing it in the folds of her borrowed clothing. The trust implied by the gift that Sigurd would arm her was not lost on her. They left as the forest began to wake, birds calling softly in the gray light of early morning. Sigurd led them not on the path to the village, but in the opposite direction, toward the rising sun and the distant ridge of mountains that formed the eastern boundary of Skjoldheim's territory. The snow made travel difficult, but Sigurd broke trail, his powerful frame forging a path that Solveig could follow. As they moved deeper into the forest, Sigurd remained vigilant, frequently stopping to listen or study their surroundings. Occasionally, he would double back on their trail or lead them through icy streams, basic tactics to confuse any pursuers. Solveig followed without complaint, though the exertion soon had her breathing hard, her still healing body protesting the strain. By midday, the forest began to thin as they approached the foothills of the eastern ridge. The terrain grew steeper, rocks and stunted pines replacing the dense woodland. They paused briefly to rest and eat a little dried meat, sheltered from the wind by a large boulder. "How much farther?" Solveig asked, her breath forming clouds in the cold air. Sigurd gestured to a particular formation halfway up the nearest slope, a dark smudge against the snow-covered rock that might have been a shadow or a crevice. "There, but the approach is treacherous. We'll need to be careful." As they resumed their journey, Solveig noticed a change in Sigurd. The closer they got to the cave, the more tension seemed to gather in his broad shoulders, his movements becoming more deliberate, almost reluctant. Whatever awaited them in that cave, it clearly held powerful memories for the Berserker. The climb was as difficult as Sigurd had warned. The slope was steep, the rocks slick with ice and hidden beneath deceptive blankets of snow. More than once, Solveig lost her footing, saved from a fall only by Sigurd's quick reflexes and strong grip. By the time they neared the dark opening Sigurd had pointed out, the sun was already beginning its descent toward the western horizon. Standing before the cave entrance, Sigurd hesitated, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. Solveig, watching him closely, saw something she had not witnessed before: fear, raw and visceral, in the eyes of the Berserker. "Sigurd," she said softly, placing a hand on his arm, "what is this place to you?" He didn't look at her, his gaze fixed on the dark opening. "A beginning," he said finally, his voice low and rough, "and an end." Before she could ask what he meant, he squared his shoulders and stepped forward into the darkness, leaving Solveig no choice but to follow. The temperature dropped immediately as they moved beyond the reach of the winter sunlight. Sigurd produced a small torch from his pack, striking flint to steel to ignite it. The flame cast dancing shadows on the rock walls, revealing a passage that led deeper into the mountain. The cave was larger than it appeared from outside, a series of chambers connected by narrow passages. Sigurd moved with the certainty of one who knew the way, though his reluctance remained evident in every step. They passed through a tight corridor that opened suddenly into a vast chamber, its ceiling lost in shadows beyond the reach of their torch.
"We'll shelter here," Sigurd said, his voice echoing slightly in the open space. "There's a spring at the back, fresh water, and the air flows well enough to allow a small fire without smoke building up." As he spoke, he was already gathering what appeared to be old dry branches from a pile near the wall, evidence that this cave had sheltered others in the past. Solveig helped prepare a fire pit, using stones scattered nearby, noting that some were already arranged in a circle, blackened from previous fires. "You've been here before," she observed. It wasn't a question. Sigurd paused in his work, his expression unreadable in the flickering torchlight. "Yes," he said simply, "many years ago." He offered nothing more, and Solveig did not press. Instead, she focused on making their temporary shelter as comfortable as possible, laying out furs near the newly kindled fire, arranging their supplies, filling water skins from the spring Sigurd had mentioned, a small stream that emerged from the rock wall, only to disappear again into the stone floor. As night fell outside, the cave grew colder despite their fire. They ate a meager meal of dried meat and hard bread, conserving their supplies. The dancing flames cast long shadows across the chamber, creating an almost dreamlike atmosphere that seemed to exist outside of time.
"Do you think they've reached Skjoldheim by now?" Solveig asked, breaking a silence that had stretched for what felt like hours. Sigurd nodded grimly. "Ulfrik will have gone to Thorvald first. Clan protocol demands it. He'll claim you as a thief, a runaway thrall perhaps. And will your elder believe him?" "Thorvald is no fool," Sigurd replied. "He'll suspect there's more to the story. But he must also protect Skjoldheim. If Ulfrik threatens violence—" He left the thought unfinished. "Then he'll allow the search," Solveig concluded, her voice hollow. "Your people will suffer for sheltering me, even unknowingly." Sigurd stared into the flames, his expression hardening. "Ulfrik has wanted an excuse to exert power over Skjoldheim for years. If not you, he would have found another reason eventually." This truth did little to ease Solveig's guilt, but she appreciated Sigurd's attempt to comfort her. They lapsed into silence again, each lost in their own thoughts as the fire crackled between them. It was Sigurd who finally spoke, his deep voice startling in the quiet of the cave. "You should know," he began, not looking at her, but keeping his gaze fixed on the flames, "why this place exists outside of time, why people avoid it." Solveig waited, sensing that whatever he was about to reveal was something he rarely, if ever, spoke of. 13 years ago, he continued after a moment, I came here with 5 others, young men from Skjoldheim, eager for glory, for our first taste of battle. His voice took on a distant quality, as if he were seeing not the cave around them, but events long past. We were to prove ourselves worthy of joining the next raid south. A simple test. Survive 3 days in the mountains, return with proof of our courage. He paused, reaching absently to touch the wolf-shaped pendant at his throat. We found this cave on the 2nd day, shelter from a storm, much like today. But we were not alone. Solveig felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cave's temperature. "What happened?" she asked softly. Sigurd's eyes, when they finally met hers, contained a pain so ancient and deep it took her breath away. "We became what we feared most," he said simply, "and only I walked out." The implications of his words hung in the air between them. Solveig wanted to ask more, needed to understand what terrible event had marked this cave as cursed, what had happened to the other young men, what Sigurd had done or failed to do, but the rawness of his expression stopped her. Some wounds were too deep to probe, even after years of supposed healing. "I'm sorry," she said instead, the words inadequate but sincere. Sigurd nodded once, accepting her sympathy without comment. He rose abruptly, moving to check the cave entrance, a practical task that allowed him to retreat from the vulnerability of the moment. When he returned to the fire, his expression had once again become the controlled mask she was more familiar with. "We should rest," he said. "Take shifts watching. Even if they track us this far, the approach is difficult to navigate in darkness. We're safe until morning, at least." Solveig agreed, settling onto the furs while Sigurd took the first watch. As she drifted toward sleep, lulled by exhaustion and the hypnotic dance of firelight, she found herself wondering about the young man Sigurd had been 13 years ago, before whatever happened in this cave had transformed him into the solitary berserker known as Wolf-Eye. And she wondered, with her last conscious thought, if that young man still existed somewhere beneath the hardened exterior, waiting for a chance at redemption. Outside, the wind picked up, howling around the mountain as if giving voice to spirits long departed. Inside the cave, Sigurd sat motionless by the fire, his eyes reflecting flames both present and remembered, as the past he had tried so hard to escape slowly closed around him once more. Dawn arrived as a subtle lightening of the darkness at the cave entrance, barely perceptible after the long night. Sigurd, who had eventually traded places with Solveig to get a few hours of restless sleep, rose silently and moved to the opening. The storm had intensified overnight, snow driving horizontally across the mountainside in white sheets that obscured visibility beyond a few paces. "A blessing and a curse," he murmured to himself. The storm would make it nearly impossible for Ulfrik's men to track them, but it also trapped them in the cave with dwindling supplies and, more dangerously for Sigurd, with memories he had spent years trying to forget. He returned to the fire, where Solveig was already awake, her green eyes watching him with quiet concern. She had said little since his partial confession the night before, sensing perhaps that he walked a precarious edge between past and present. "The storm rages," he reported, crouching to add more wood to their fire. "We'll need to conserve our supplies, no knowing how long we'll be here." Solveig nodded, accepting this news with the same quiet resilience she had shown throughout their journey. "I've prepared what remains of the bread," she said, indicating the small portions she had divided. "If we're careful, it will last 2 days, perhaps 3. They ate in silence, the howling wind and crackling fire the only sounds in the vast chamber. When they had finished, Sigurd rose restlessly, pacing the perimeter of the cave with the measured stride of a caged wolf. Solveig watched him, her expression thoughtful. "This place haunts you," she said finally, her voice gentle but direct. "Yet you brought us here, knowing what it would cost you to return." Sigurd paused in his pacing, his back to her, shoulders tense beneath his heavy tunic. For a long moment he said nothing, and Solveig thought he might ignore her observation entirely. Then, without turning, he spoke. "Some debts can never be repaid," he said, his voice barely audible above the wind. "Some ghosts never rest." He turned then, his gray eyes meeting hers across the fire. "But yes, I brought us here because it was the only safe choice. Ulfrik's men will not find this place, or if they do, they will not enter. The reputation of this cave protects us more surely than any weapon." "Because of what happened 13 years ago," Solveig said, connecting the threads of his earlier story. "What people believe happened here." A bitter smile touched Sigurd's lips. "What they believe is a shadow of the truth." He moved back to the fire, settling heavily on a flat stone opposite Solveig.
They say this cave is haunted by the spirits of young warriors who turned on each other in bloodlust. They say only one survived, a berserker who carried the curse out into the world. He stared into the flames, his expression distant. What they don't say, because they don't know, is why it happened. What we found here that night that turned friend against friend, brother against brother. Solveig leaned forward slightly, drawn by the raw emotion in his voice. "What did you find, Sigurd?" she asked softly. For a moment it seemed he wouldn't answer. Then, with a deep breath that seemed to come from the very core of his being, he began to speak. "We were 6. Myself, Halfdan, Eric, Thorstein, Gunnar, and Leif. Childhood friends, all eager to prove ourselves worthy of joining the men on raids. The test was simple enough. Survive in the mountains for 3 days, return with some token of courage. We thought ourselves already warriors, though none of us had yet seen true battle." His voice took on a rhythmic quality, like a skald reciting an ancient tale. "The storm caught us on the 2nd day, driving us to seek shelter. We found this cave, thought ourselves fortunate. There was evidence others had used it before, old fire pits, like the one we use now, scraps of bone and hide." He paused, his hand unconsciously moving to the wolf pendant at his throat. "As we settled for the night, Leif discovered a passage at the back of the cave, beyond the spring. Narrow, almost hidden behind a fall of rock. Being the smallest among us, he squeezed through first, calling back that there was another chamber beyond. Sigurd's eyes had taken on a faraway look, seeing not the cave as it was now, but as it had been that fateful night. We followed, one by one, into a chamber smaller than this one, but with walls that reflected the light strangely. Thorstein thought it was silver, embedded in the rock. We were excited, imagining the wealth we might claim, the honor of discovering such a treasure." His expression darkened. "But it wasn't silver. It was something else, something older, something that seemed to whisper, though none of us would admit hearing it at first. There was a stone in the center of that chamber, shaped like an altar, and on it—" He faltered for the first time, his composure cracking. "On it lay the remains of something that had once been human. Ancient, preserved by the cold and the strange properties of that inner cave. Dressed in garments none of us recognized, with symbols carved into leathery skin." Solveig felt a chill run down her spine, but she remained silent, allowing Sigurd to continue at his own pace. "We should have left immediately," he said, his voice hollow with regret. "Should have recognized the wrongness of that place. But we were young, foolish. Halfdan suggested we take something from the body, proof of our courage, he said, a trophy to show the elders." Sigurd's hands clenched into fists. That's when the whispering became louder. Not in our ears, but in our minds. Each of us heard something different, I think. Promises, temptations. For me, it was power, the strength to protect those I loved, to never feel helpless again. He looked up, meeting Solveig's gaze directly. What happened next, I still don't fully understand. The whispers turned to screams. The air in that chamber grew thick, hard to breathe. And something changed in my friends, in me. We turned on each other like animals, with a fury I had never known existed within me. The pain in his voice was raw, immediate, as if the events he described had happened yesterday rather than 13 years ago. When I came back to myself, I was alone among the bodies of my friends. My hands were covered in their blood. My mouth tasted of it.
Solveig couldn't suppress a small gasp at this revelation, but Sigurd continued, seemingly compelled now to complete the terrible tale. I fled from that inner chamber, back to this one, spent the night huddled by a fire much like this, certain that whatever had possessed us would return for me. When morning came and I still lived, I sealed the passage with rocks from the cave floor, then staggered back to Skjoldheim. He fell silent, the conclusion of his story hanging in the air between them. Solveig waited, sensing there was more he needed to say. I told them we were attacked by a bear, he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. That I alone escaped. They believed me, or pretended to. But something in me had changed. The rage that had consumed me in that inner chamber never fully left. It became part of me, a beast I learned to control and channel in battle, the Berserker fury. He touched the scar on his lip, a gesture Solveig had noticed before, but now understood to be connected to that night. This came from Thorstein's knife, a reminder I keep of the price of my survival. Solveig sat in stunned silence, absorbing the weight of Sigurd's confession. The horror of what he described, the possession, the bloodshed, the terrible burden of survival was almost beyond comprehension. Yet she found herself not afraid of him, but for him. The pain he had carried for 13 years, the guilt and shame that had driven him to isolation, seemed a punishment far greater than any crime. You were not yourself, she said finally, her voice soft but firm. Whatever power dwelled in that inner chamber used you, all of you, for its own purposes. Sigurd shook his head, rejecting her attempt at absolution. I made the choice to enter, to stay when we should have fled. And part of me, he hesitated, then forced himself to continue. Part of me embraced the rage, welcomed it. That choice was mine alone. Solveig moved around the fire to sit beside him, close enough that he could feel her presence, but not touching him. We all carry darkness within us, Sigurd. The capacity for rage, for violence. That doesn't make us monsters, it makes us human. He looked at her then, really looked at her, seeing not just the young seer who had stumbled into his life, but a woman of remarkable strength and wisdom. You've seen much suffering, he observed quietly. Yet you haven't surrendered to hatred or despair. Nor have you, she countered. You could have become the monster you fear, using your berserker rage for cruelty or personal gain. Instead, you isolated yourself, protecting others from what you believed yourself capable of. She reached out slowly, giving him time to withdraw if he wished, and placed her hand over his clenched fist. And when you found me in the forest, you chose compassion over safety. That is not the choice of a monster, Sigurd Wolfeye. The simple touch, the first genuine human connection he had allowed himself in years, broke something open inside Sigurd. Not the berserker rage, but something equally powerful, grief, long suppressed, for the friends he had lost, for the young man he had been, for all the years spent in solitary penance. Outside, the storm continued to howl, as if giving voice to emotions too vast for human expression. Inside the cave, two souls bound by circumstance and choice sat in silence by the fire, finding in shared darkness an unexpected light. The storm raged for 2 more days, trapping Sigurd and Solveig in the cave, with dwindling supplies and growing uncertainty. They rationed carefully, melted snow for water when the spring proved too cold to drink from for long, and maintained their fire with the remaining wood.
During this time, a fragile trust continued to build between them, founded on the terrible honesty of Sigurd's confession and Solveig's acceptance of it. On the morning of the third day, they woke to silence. The howling wind had finally ceased. Sigurd moved cautiously to the cave entrance, where weak sunlight now penetrated the gloom. The world outside was transformed, buried under feet of fresh snow that sparkled blindingly in the morning light. "The storm has passed," he reported, returning to where Solveig sat by their much diminished fire. "But the snow is deep. Travel will be difficult." Solveig nodded, her face thin from days of minimal food, but her eyes still bright with determination. "We can't stay here much longer," she observed practically. "Our supplies won't last another day." Sigurd knew she was right. The decision to seek shelter in the cave had saved them from immediate pursuit, but now presented a new danger: starvation. They would need to risk returning to lower ground, perhaps even to his cabin, to replenish their stores. "We'll leave at midday," he decided. "The sun will be strongest then, making the descent slightly less treacherous." As they packed their few belongings and prepared for the journey, Sigurd found himself unusually alert, his senses straining for any sign of danger. Something felt wrong, a prickling at the back of his neck, a tension in the air that reminded him uncomfortably of that night 13 years ago. "Sigurd?" Solveig's voice broke through his unease. "What troubles you?" He shook his head, unable to articulate the formless dread that had settled over him. "Just caution," he said, not entirely truthfully. "The mountain can be deceptive after a storm." They set out as planned, emerging from the cave into a world of blinding white. The descent proved even more challenging than Sigurd had anticipated. The fresh snow concealed treacherous ice beneath, and more than once they narrowly avoided falls that could have proven fatal. By the time they reached the tree line, the sun was already beginning its descent toward the western horizon. Sigurd paused, surveying the forest below them. From this vantage point they could see for miles the snow-covered expanse of trees, the distant smoke from Skoldheim's hearth fires, and, most alarmingly, what appeared to be a group of riders moving along the edge of the forest nearest his cabin. "Ulfrik's men," he said grimly, pointing out the distant figures to Solveig. "Still searching." Solveig's face paled slightly, but her voice remained steady. "What now? We can't return to your cabin." Sigurd considered their options, none of which seemed particularly promising. They couldn't risk approaching Skoldheim with Ulfrik's men so close. The cave behind them offered shelter but no food. Continuing east would eventually lead them to Ulfrik's own territory, certain death for both of them. "South," he decided finally. "There's an old hunting lodge a half-day's journey from here, used mainly in summer, but stocked with basic supplies. We might find enough to sustain us until Ulfrik's men give up the search." It was a desperate plan, relying on too many uncertainties, but it was the best he could offer. Solveig seemed to understand this, nodding her acceptance without question. They began their careful descent into the forest, moving perpendicular to the path the riders had taken, using the trees for cover. Progress was painfully slow. The snow reached past their knees in places, each step requiring significant effort. Sigurd broke trail, his greater strength creating a path that Solveig could follow, but even his endurance had limits. By the time twilight began to settle over the forest, they had covered perhaps half the distance to the hunting lodge, and both were exhausted. "We need to rest," Solveig said finally, her breathing labored, face flushed despite the cold. "Just for a moment." Sigurd knew she was right.
Pushing on in darkness would be foolhardy at best, fatal at worst. They found shelter beneath the spreading branches of a massive pine, where the snow was shallower and the ground relatively dry. Using his axe, Sigurd cleared a space large enough for them to sit, then spread one of their furs as a barrier against the cold earth. "We can't risk a fire," he said apologetically, as they settled onto the makeshift seat. "The light would be visible for miles in this clear air." Solveig nodded, drawing her cloak tighter around her shoulders. "How much farther to this lodge?" "If we start at first light, we should reach it by midday tomorrow," Sigurd replied, offering her the last of their dried meat. "Assuming no further storms or complications." The unspoken complication, discovery by Ulfrik's men, hung between them. Solveig accepted the food with murmured thanks, chewing slowly to make the meager portion last. As darkness settled fully around them, the forest grew eerily quiet, the snow dampening even the usual night sounds. "Try to rest," Sigurd advised, positioning himself so his back rested against the trunk of the pine, giving him a clear view of their surroundings. "I'll keep watch." Solveig hesitated, clearly reluctant to sleep while Sigurd remained vigilant. "You need rest too," she pointed out. "You've been breaking trail all day." He shook his head, the stubborn set of his jaw indicating this was not a point he would concede. "I'm accustomed to going without sleep during raids. A single night is nothing." Recognizing the futility of argument, Solveig settled beside him, drawing the second fur over herself like a blanket. Despite her exhaustion, sleep seemed elusive, her mind too active with thoughts of pursuit, of Ulfrik's men combing the forest for her, of the uncertain future that awaited her even if they survived this immediate danger. "What will happen," she asked quietly, "if we reach spring, if we survive until then?" Sigurd, his gaze fixed on the darkness beyond their shelter, considered the question carefully. "The coastal settlements will begin trading again. Ships will arrive from the south and east. With silver, we could secure passage for you, somewhere beyond Ulfrik's reach." "And you?" she pressed. "Would you remain here alone with your ghosts?" The question caught him off guard. In truth, he had not thought beyond ensuring Solveig's safety. The idea that he might have choices, might forge a different path for himself, seemed almost foreign after years of self-imposed isolation. "I don't know," he admitted finally. "Skoldheim is the only home I've known. But after harboring you, defying Ulfrik, my place there may be forfeit regardless." Solveig was silent for a long moment, digesting this. "Then perhaps," she said carefully, "we both seek new beginnings when spring comes." The simple statement carried implications that Sigurd wasn't ready to examine too closely, of shared futures, of possibilities beyond mere survival. He grunted non-committally, neither accepting nor rejecting the idea outright. Silence fell between them once more, broken only by the occasional soft sound of snow falling from overburdened branches. Eventually, Solveig's breathing deepened and slowed as exhaustion finally claimed her. Sigurd remained awake, his senses attuned to the forest around them, his mind replaying the events that had led him to this moment, from finding Solveig in the forest to their desperate flight from the cave that held his darkest secrets. It occurred to him, with a clarity that was almost painful, that in helping Solveig escape her captivity, he had begun to free himself from a different kind of prison. One built of guilt and isolation, with walls reinforced by years of self-recrimination. Whether they survived the coming days or not, something had changed irrevocably within him. The night deepened around them, stars appearing in the clear sky above the pine's sheltering branches. Sigurd kept his silent vigil, one hand resting lightly on his axe, the other absently touching the wolf pendant at his throat. A gesture that had once been a reminder of duty and honor, but now felt more like a connection to something he had thought lost forever: hope. Dawn broke clear and cold, the forest transformed into a crystalline wonderland as first light caught the snow-laden branches. Sigurd, who had maintained his vigilant watch through the night, gently roused Solveig from her slumber. She woke quickly, the wariness of one accustomed to danger evident in her immediate alertness. "All quiet?" she asked, her voice hushed despite the apparent solitude of their surroundings. Sigurd nodded, rising stiffly to his feet. The cold had settled deep in his bones during the night, and even his considerable endurance had limits. "We should move while the light is good," he said, offering a hand to help her up. "The lodge lies beyond that ridge."
He pointed south, where a gentle rise in the terrain was visible through the trees. They set out after a brief meal of snow melted in their palms and the very last scraps of their provisions. The going was marginally easier than the previous day. The snow had settled somewhat, and in places, game trails provided paths of less resistance. Still, by mid-morning, both were breathing hard, their progress slowed by exhaustion and hunger. It was during a brief rest that Sigurd first noticed the smoke, a thin column rising from beyond the ridge they were approaching. His body tensed immediately, hand moving to his axe. "Someone's at the lodge," he said quietly, nodding toward the telltale sign. Solveig followed his gaze, her expression tightening with concern. Ulfrik's men? Possibly, or hunters from Skjöldheim. Neither option was particularly reassuring. If Ulfrik's men had found the lodge, approaching would mean walking directly into danger. If it was hunters from his own village, they might be sympathetic, but they might also feel compelled to report his whereabouts to Thorvald, especially if they knew of Ulfrik's search. "We need to know who," Sigurd decided after a moment's consideration. "Wait here. I'll scout ahead." Solveig caught his arm as he prepared to leave. "Be careful," she said simply, her green eyes meeting his with an intensity that conveyed far more than the words themselves. Sigurd nodded once, then moved silently through the trees, years of hunting and raiding making his progress nearly soundless despite the snow. As he neared the ridge, he dropped to a crouch, using the undergrowth for cover as he approached a vantage point that would allow him to see the lodge without being seen. What he observed sent a chill through him that had nothing to do with the winter air. The lodge, a simple structure of logs and stone, built generations ago as a waypoint for hunting parties, was indeed occupied.
But not by Ulfrik's warriors, as he had feared, nor by hunters from Skjöldheim. Instead, a single figure moved around the exterior, gathering wood from the pile stacked against one wall. Even from this distance, Sigurd recognized the distinctive silhouette, the black hair pulled into a high knot, the bear fur cloak that hung from broad shoulders. Ulfrik Gudmundsson himself had come to the hunt. Sigurd withdrew carefully, mind racing. If Ulfrik was here personally, rather than with his war party, it suggested the search had split up, small groups scouring different areas, with Ulfrik taking this remote location for himself. It was both a stroke of terrible luck and potentially an opportunity. A single opponent, even one as formidable as Ulfrik, presented different challenges than a group of warriors. He returned to where Solveig waited, her face tense with anticipation. "Ulfrik," he said simply, watching as fear and then a complicated mixture of emotions crossed her features. "Alone, as far as I can tell." "He wouldn't be," Solveig said with certainty. "He never travels without at least 2 guards. They must be inside or hunting nearby." Sigurd considered this information, adjusting his mental assessment of the situation. "We can't approach the lodge," he concluded reluctantly. "Too risky with unknown numbers." "Then where?" Solveig asked, the strain of their journey evident in the shadows beneath her eyes, the hollowness of her cheeks. "We have no food, no shelter. The cold alone will kill us if we spend another night in the open." She was right, and Sigurd knew it. The brief rest had allowed the cold to seep back into his limbs, reminding him of their precarious position. Without food or proper shelter, they would not survive much longer, especially Solveig, whose body was still recovering from her earlier ordeal. A decision formed in Sigurd's mind, not a good one perhaps, but the only one that offered any chance of survival.
"There's a place," he said slowly, "not far from here. A shrine to the old gods, built by my grandfather's generation. Small, but enclosed. It might have been overlooked in the search." Solveig studied his face, clearly sensing there was more to this suggestion than he was saying. "And food?" "No," Sigurd admitted, "but it would give us shelter for the night. And—" he hesitated, then continued with reluctance, "and it would give me a chance to end this." Understanding dawned in Solveig's eyes. "You mean to confront Ulfrik," she said, not a question but a statement. "Not directly," Sigurd clarified, "but to observe, to learn his patterns. If he separated from the main party, there might be an opportunity to neutralize the threat." The implication was clear enough. Solveig's expression grew troubled, but she didn't immediately reject the idea. After all they had endured, after what she had suffered at Ulfrik's hands, the moral calculus of violence had shifted. "Lead on," she said finally, her voice steady despite the weight of what they were considering. "To this shrine." They changed direction, moving east rather than continuing south toward the lodge. The shrine, as Sigurd had indicated, was not far, perhaps an hour's journey through increasingly dense forest. When they arrived, Solveig understood why Sigurd believed it might have been overlooked in the search. The structure was small, barely larger than a woodsman's hut, and built directly into the side of a steep embankment. Trees had grown close around it over the years, their branches partially obscuring it from view. The entrance, a simple doorway with a rotting wooden door hanging askew from rusted hinges, faced away from the main forest paths. Inside, the shrine was a single room with a stone altar at its center. Carvings decorated the walls, ancient symbols representing the old gods, worn smooth by time and the elements that entered through gaps in the deteriorating structure. It was cold, but significantly warmer than the open forest, and the roof, though sagging in places, appeared to be largely intact. "It's not much," Sigurd acknowledged as they entered, "but it will shelter us from the wind at least." Solveig moved around the small space, examining the carvings with evident interest. "Your people built this?" she asked, fingers tracing a symbol that represented Freya, goddess of Seder, the very magic that gave Solveig her visions. "My grandfather's generation," Sigurd confirmed. "Before the village proper was established. They believed this place held power, that the boundary between worlds was thinner here." Something in his tone caught Solveig's attention. "You don't believe that?" Sigurd's expression darkened slightly. "After what I experienced in the cave, I believe there are forces beyond our understanding. Whether they are gods or something older, something different, I cannot say." This philosophical discussion might have continued, but practicality intervened. They needed to prepare the shrine for the coming night, to make it as warm and secure as possible. Sigurd repaired the door as best he could with materials at hand, while Solveig cleared years of debris from the floor, creating a space where they could rest. No fire, Sigurd cautioned as evening approached. The smoke would be visible for miles. Instead, they huddled together on the cleanest part of the floor, sharing body heat beneath their furs. Outside, the early winter darkness fell swiftly, bringing with it a bone-deep cold that penetrated even the shrine's walls. "What's your plan?" Solveig asked finally, her voice soft in the darkness. "For Ulfrik?" Sigurd was silent for a long moment, organizing his thoughts. "I'll return to the lodge before dawn," he said eventually. "Observe his movements, learn how many men are with him. If an opportunity presents itself—" He left the thought unfinished. "And if it doesn't?" Solveig pressed.
"Or if his war party returns before you can act?" These were fair questions, the very ones Sigurd had been asking himself since formulating this desperate plan. "Then we continue east," he said, though they both knew how unlikely survival would be without supplies. "Or north, back toward the cave. The storm will have replenished the game in the forest. I might be able to hunt." Solveig sighed, her breath visible even in the darkness of the shrine. "We both know those aren't real options," she said with surprising gentleness. "Without food, without proper shelter, we won't last another week. And Ulfrik won't give up the search, not for me." Her candor was both refreshing and unsettling. Sigurd had led raids, had made life-or-death decisions in battle. But this felt different, more personal, more weighted with responsibility for someone other than himself or fellow warriors who understood the risks of their chosen path. "There's something else," Solveig continued after a moment of silence. "Something I haven't told you." Sigurd turned slightly, trying to make out her expression in the near-total darkness. "What is it?" "My visions," she said, her voice taking on the distant quality he had noticed when she spoke of her gift. "They've shown me more than just Ulfrik's search party. They've shown me endings, possibilities." A chill that had nothing to do with the winter night ran down Sigurd's spine. "What have you seen?" he asked, not entirely sure he wanted to know the answer. "Blood on snow," Solveig replied softly. "A battle in a sacred place. And—" she hesitated, then continued with evident reluctance, "and a cave where the past and present meet." The cave. Of course it would come back to the cave. Sigurd felt a weight settle in his chest, a certainty that had been building since they fled Skoldheim. "The same cave," he said, not a question, but a statement. "The one we left." Solveig nodded, the movement barely perceptible in the darkness.
"I believe so. The details are unclear. Visions are rarely straightforward, but there's a sense of completion, of circles closing." "And do these visions show who survives this completion?" Sigurd asked, his voice rougher than he intended. Solveig's hand found his in the darkness, her fingers surprisingly warm against his cold skin. "That depends on choices yet unmade," she said simply. "The future is not fixed, Sigurd. It's shaped by will and heart as much as by fate." The touch of her hand, the quiet certainty in her voice, stirred something in Sigurd that he had thought long dead, a belief in possibility, in paths not yet taken. For 13 years he had lived as if his course was set, his penance predetermined. The idea that he might still have choices, that the future remained unwritten, was both terrifying and exhilarating. "Rest now," he said, gently squeezing her hand before releasing it. "Tomorrow will bring what it brings." As Solveig's breathing gradually deepened into sleep, Sigurd remained awake, his mind turning over the implications of her vision. Blood on snow.
A battle in a sacred place. The cave where past and present meet. It seemed the gods, or whatever forces truly governed their world, had a sense of symmetry, if not of mercy. Outside, the night grew deeper, stars wheeling overhead in their ancient patterns. Inside the shrine, Sigurd Wulfi made his peace with what morning might bring, and for the first time in 13 years surrendered himself fully to whatever fate awaited him. The pre-dawn darkness found Sigurd already awake, preparing for what might be his final battle. He checked his axe, running a thumb along the edge to confirm its sharpness. The weapon had served him well in countless raids and skirmishes, its weight familiar in his hand, its balance perfect for his fighting style. If today was to be his last day among the living, at least he would face his end with a trusted companion.
Solveig stirred as he moved about the small shrine, her eyes finding him immediately in the gloom. No words were needed. She understood what he intended, and they had said all that needed saying during the night. Instead, she rose and helped him prepare, adjusting his cloak, ensuring the wolf pendant hung securely at his throat. "If I don't return by midday," Sigurd said finally, breaking the silence, "make for the eastern ridge. There's a path that leads down to the fjord. Follow it. When you reach the water, turn north. A day's journey will bring you to a fishing village, small, independent. They might shelter you until spring." Solveig's expression made it clear she had no intention of fleeing without him, but she nodded nonetheless, accepting the information. "May the gods guide your blade," she said simply, touching his arm in a gesture that conveyed far more than words could have. Sigurd left the shrine as the first hints of gray lightened the eastern sky. The forest was still, the air so cold it burned his lungs with each breath. He moved silently through the trees, retracing their path from the previous day, until he neared the ridge. Approaching cautiously, he found a vantage point that offered a clear view of the lodge while providing ample cover. The building sat in a small clearing, smoke rising from its stone chimney in a thin column that disappeared into the pale morning sky. A horse, Ulfrik's distinctive black stallion, was tethered to a post near the entrance. 2 other horses stood nearby, confirming Solveig's assertion that Ulfrik would not travel alone. Sigurd settled in to observe, patient as only a hunter can be. The cold seeped into his limbs, but he ignored it, his focus entirely on the lodge and its occupants. As the sun cleared the horizon, the door opened, and a figure emerged. Not Ulfrik, but one of his thanes, a warrior Sigurd recognized from previous encounters between their clans.
The man stretched, surveyed the clearing briefly, then moved to check on the horses. A second warrior joined the first shortly thereafter. They spoke briefly, their words inaudible at this distance, but their gestures suggesting some disagreement. After a moment, the second man returned to the lodge, while the first began gathering wood from the pile stacked against the building's wall. Of Ulfrik himself there was no sign. Sigurd waited, the sun climbing higher in the sky, bringing no warmth but increasing visibility. The first warrior completed his task with the wood and disappeared back into the lodge. Time stretched, measured only by the gradual shift of shadows across the snow-covered clearing. Finally, near mid-morning, the door opened again, and Ulfrik Gudmundsson himself emerged. Even at a distance, his presence commanded attention. Tall, broad-shouldered, his black hair pulled into the high knot that had become his signature. His bearskin cloak hanging from shoulders that had not lost their warrior's strength despite his years as a chieftain.
The scar on his cheek, earned in the raid that had first brought him to prominence, was visible even from Sigurd's position, a pale line against weather-darkened skin. Ulfrik spoke to the two warriors who followed him outside, his gestures indicating he was issuing orders. After a brief discussion, the men nodded and began preparing their horses, while Ulfrik himself moved to the edge of the clearing, staring into the forest with an intensity that made Sigurd instinctively press closer to the ground, though he knew he was well hidden. The warriors mounted and rode off, heading west, toward Skjoldheim, Sigurd realized. Ulfrik remained at the lodge, watching until his men disappeared from view, then turned and re-entered the building. Alone. The opportunity Sigurd had hoped for had presented itself with unexpected ease.
Ulfrik, separated from his guards, isolated in the hunting lodge. It was almost too perfect, raising Sigurd's suspicions. Could it be a trap? Had they somehow detected his presence? He considered the possibilities carefully. If it was a trap, the warriors would not have ridden west. They would have circled around to approach from behind while Ulfrik drew his attention. The fact that they had genuinely departed suggested Ulfrik truly believed himself alone, perhaps confident that no threat could reach him here, so deep in the forest. Decision made, Sigurd began his approach. He circled wide around the clearing, coming at the lodge from the opposite direction to the one he had been observing from. The snow complicated matters, making silent movement nearly impossible, but it also provided cover. The crunch of footsteps could be attributed to forest animals or branches settling under their white burden. As he neared the edge of the clearing, Sigurd paused, studying the lodge one final time. No movement was visible through the single window, no sound apart from the occasional crack of the fire inside. Taking a deep breath, he adjusted his grip on his axe and stepped out from the tree line, crossing the open space with swift, purposeful strides. At the door, he hesitated for just a moment, not out of fear, but to center himself, to call upon the cold clarity that had served him in countless battles. Then, with a single powerful kick, he drove the door inward, wood splintering around the latch as it flew open. Ulfrik was seated at a rough-hewn table, a horn of mead in one hand, a knife in the other, as he cut slices from a joint of meat. He looked up at the intrusion, surprise flickering across his features before recognition dawned. Then, most disconcertingly of all, he smiled. "Sigurd Haraldsson," he said, his voice as Sigurd remembered it, deep, resonant, with the confidence of a man accustomed to command. "The wolf-eye of Skjoldheim. I was beginning to think you'd never make your move." Sigurd remained in the doorway, axe at the ready, senses alert for any sign of deception or hidden threat. "You knew I was watching," he stated rather than asked. Ulfrik's smile widened slightly. "Not specifically you, no, but I knew someone was in these woods. Tracks don't lie, even after a storm. And when my men found your cabin empty, but recently occupied," he shrugged, taking a deliberate sip from his horn, "it wasn't difficult to guess you might be nearby. The girl with you, I presume?" The casual mention of Solveig sent a surge of protective anger through Sigurd, but he controlled it, keeping his expression neutral. "Your business is with me now," he said evenly, "not her." Ulfrik set down his horn, studying Sigurd with genuine curiosity. "And what business might that be, Wolf-eye? You're not of my clan, nor have our people quarreled recently. Yet here you stand in my doorway, weapon in hand, looking very much like a man come to kill."
There was something almost theatrical about Ulfrik's calm, as if he were playing a role in some saga rather than facing a genuine threat to his life. It unsettled Sigurd, making him question his own perception of the situation. "You hunt an innocent woman," Sigurd replied, stepping fully into the lodge, but keeping his distance from Ulfrik. "You threatened my village, my people. That makes it my business." Ulfrik laughed, the sound unexpectedly genuine. "Innocent? Is that what she told you?" He shook his head, almost pityingly. "The girl is a scythe worker, a weaver of dreams and deceits. Whatever tale of woe she spun for you, I assure you, the truth is far less flattering to her." "I've seen her wounds," Sigurd countered, anger edging into his voice despite his efforts at control. "The marks your men left on her. There's no tale that justifies such treatment." Ulfrik's expression hardened slightly, the first crack in his affable facade. "She was punishment for insubordination, necessary if regrettable. Surely even in Skjoldheim discipline is maintained." "Not through torture," Sigurd replied coldly, "not against those who seek only their freedom." "Freedom," Ulfrik repeated, as if tasting the word and finding it bitter. "A pretty concept, but ultimately meaningless. We are all bound by duty, by blood, by the very fate the Norns weave for us." He leaned forward slightly, his gaze intensifying. "Even you, Wulfi, for all your solitude and chosen exile, you're bound by the blood on your hands, are you not? By what happened in that cave 13 years ago." The mention of the cave sent a shock through Sigurd like a blade of ice. How could Ulfrik know of that? The story was known in Skjoldheim, of course, but the details, the true details, had never been shared beyond the village. Seeing the effect of his words, Ulfrik's smile returned, colder now. "Oh yes, I know about your little secret. Did you think such power goes unnoticed? The cave has a reputation, shall we say, one that extends beyond your village's boundaries." Understanding dawned on Sigurd with sickening clarity. "The inner chamber," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You've been there." Ulfrik inclined his head in acknowledgement. "Many years ago, before I became chieftain, I too heard the whispers, felt the promise of power. But unlike you, Wulfi, I did not flee from it. I embraced what was offered." The implications of this confession were staggering. If Ulfrik had encountered the same malevolent presence Sigurd and his friends had found, if he had willingly accepted its influence— "What are you?" Sigurd asked, his grip tightening on his axe. "A man with vision," Ulfrik replied simply. "A man who understands that power requires sacrifice. The old ways, the true ways, have been forgotten, diluted. I seek to restore them." He rose from the table, moving with a fluid grace that belied his size.
The girl's visions are part of that restoration. Her mother's gift, passed down through blood, is rare and valuable. With it, I can find other places of power, other sources to top. Sigurd took an involuntary step backward, revulsion washing over him. You would use her to find more places like the cave? To spread whatever corruption lives there? Corruption? Ulfrik laughed again, but there was no humor in it now. Such a limited perspective. It's not corruption, Wulfi. It's transformation, evolution, the next step in our people's journey.
As he spoke, something shifted in Ulfrik's eyes, a darkness gathering, a shadow that seemed to deepen the natural gray of his irises until they appeared almost black. It was subtle, easily dismissed as a trick of the light, but Sigurd had seen similar changes in his own reflection after that night in the cave. The mark of something other, something that did not belong in the natural world. "You're mad," Sigurd said flatly, raising his axe to a fighting position. "Whatever you found in that cave has twisted your mind." "Or perhaps it opened it," Ulfrik countered, reaching for his own weapon, a long-bladed knife that had been concealed beneath his cloak. "Perhaps it showed me truths you're too afraid to face." There would be no more words, Sigurd realized, no resolution except through blood. He had come here intending to end the threat Ulfrik posed to Solveig, but now understood the danger was far greater than he had imagined. This was not merely about one woman's freedom or one chieftain's wounded pride. It was about something ancient and malevolent extending its reach through Ulfrik's ambition. With a roar that was part battle cry, part release of 13 years of suppressed rage, Sigurd launched himself at Ulfrik. His axe described a deadly arc through the air, aiming for the junction of neck and shoulder, a killing blow if it landed.
But Ulfrik was faster than his bulk suggested, sidestepping the attack with practiced ease. His knife darted out, seeking Sigurd's exposed side, only to be deflected by a desperate twist of Sigurd's body. They separated, circling each other in the confined space of the lodge, each measuring the other's strengths and weaknesses. "The Berserker fury serves you well," Ulfrik observed, his voice unnervingly calm despite the violence of their exchange. "Imagine how much stronger it could be if you embrace it fully, as I have embraced my gift." "It's no gift," Sigurd growled, feinting left before attacking from the right, his axe whistling through the air. "It's a curse, a parasite that feeds on our darkest impulses." Ulfrik parried the blow with surprising strength, the clash of metal on metal ringing through the lodge. "Parasite? No, Wolf-Eye. It's a symbiosis, a partnership with something greater than ourselves." Their weapons locked momentarily, bringing them face to face. This close, Sigurd could see the changes in Ulfrik more clearly. Not just the darkness in his eyes, but a subtle wrongness to his features, as if something else looked out from behind the mask of humanity. With a surge of strength born of revulsion, Sigurd broke the deadlock, shoving Ulfrik backward. The chieftain stumbled, colliding with the table and sending it crashing to the floor. Mead spilled across the wooden planks, the rich smell mingling with the metallic scent of blood, where Sigurd's axe had finally found its mark, a shallow cut along Ulfrik's forearm. First blood to Sigurd, but the wound seemed to energize rather than weaken Ulfrik. He straightened, a smile spreading across his face that had nothing human in it. "Yes," he hissed, his voice altered, deeper, with harmonics that raised the hair on Sigurd's arms. "This is what it wants. Blood. Conflict. Feed it, Wolf-Eye. Feed it as I have." The darkness in Ulfrik's eyes spread, veins of black extending across his face like cracks in ice. His movements became more fluid, more predatory, as if the human constraints of muscle and bone no longer applied. When he attacked again, it was with inhuman speed, the knife a blur that Sigurd barely managed to deflect. The fight became desperate, primal, no longer a contest of skill, but of will, of fundamental nature. Sigurd found himself drawing upon reserves of strength he had not accessed since that night in the cave. The Berserker fury rising within him, not as a red mist of rage, but as a cold, clear purpose.
This was what he had been preparing for all these years, whether he knew it or not. Not just a battle with Ulfrik, but a reckoning with the darkness that had touched them both. They crashed through the lodge, destroying furniture, leaving smears of blood on walls and floor. Ulfrik's knife found Sigurd's shoulder, slicing deep before being wrenched free. Sigurd's axe connected with Ulfrik's thigh, the blade biting through leather and flesh to scrape against bone. Neither man made a sound beyond the harsh rasp of labored breathing. This was beyond pain, beyond normal human response. As the fight wore on, Sigurd began to tire, his wounds slowing him, blood loss weakening his limbs. Ulfrik, despite his own injuries, seemed only to grow stronger, the darkness spreading further across his features, lending him a terrible vitality. It was as if he drew strength directly from the violence, from the very life force that drained from Sigurd with each passing moment. A misstep, a moment's hesitation, and suddenly Ulfrik's knife was at Sigurd's throat, the edge pressing against skin, drawing a thin line of blood. Sigurd's axe arm was pinned against the wall, useless. They stood frozen in this deadly embrace, each man's breath hot on the other's face. "You could have been like me," Ulfrik said, his voice that strange dual tone that set Sigurd's teeth on edge.
"Could have learned to use the gift rather than fear it. Such a waste." Sigurd met his gaze directly, refusing to look away from the darkness that had consumed Ulfrik's eyes. "I would rather die as a man," he replied steadily, "than live as whatever you've become." Something flickered across Ulfrik's face, an emotion too human for the creature he was becoming. Regret, perhaps, or a fleeting recognition of what he had sacrificed in his pursuit of power. "Then die," he said simply, and began to press the knife deeper. In that moment, as Sigurd felt his life balancing on the edge of Ulfrik's blade, a sound came from the doorway. A voice, clear and commanding, speaking words in a language older than the Norse they knew. Ancient words, power-laden words that seemed to vibrate in the very air of the lodge. Solveig stood in the shattered doorframe, her slight figure somehow imposing, her green eyes blazing with an inner light. The broken raven amulet hung from her neck, glowing with a soft blue radiance that illuminated her face from below. She continued the chant, her hands describing complex patterns in the air before her. Ulfrik recoiled as if struck, the knife falling away from Sigurd's throat. "No," he snarled, the dual tones of his voice separating, becoming a chorus of denial. "You cannot." "I can," Solveig interrupted, her own voice layered now, as if multiple women spoke through her, perhaps the voices of all the seers in her lineage, reaching back to times before memory. "I am my mother's daughter, and her mother's before her. The old blood runs in my veins, Ulfrik Gudmundsson, and it will not be used for your corruption." She advanced into the lodge, still chanting between phrases, the blue light from her amulet growing stronger with each step. Ulfrik retreated before her, his face contorted in a mixture of rage and fear. "You think your women's magic can stand against what I've become?" he demanded, though the uncertainty in his voice belied his bravado. "Against what I serve." "I know it can," Solveig replied with quiet certainty, "because unlike you, I never turned away from who I truly am. I never surrendered my humanity for power." She looked to Sigurd then, their eyes meeting across the blood-spattered room. "The cave," she said simply. "It must end where it began." Understanding flooded through Sigurd, not just intellectual comprehension, but a bone-deep knowing. The cave, of course, the source of the corruption, the place where the boundary between worlds was thinnest, where past and present could meet, as Solveig's vision had shown. Ulfrik seemed to understand, too, his expression shifting from fear to calculation. Yes, he said, the multiple voices finding harmony once more. Let us return to the beginning, Wolfi. Let us finish what was started 13 years ago. Without warning, he lunged not at Sigurd, but at Solveig, knife flashing in the blue light of her amulet. Sigurd reacted instinctively, throwing himself between them, his axe coming up to deflect the blow. Metal met metal with a shower of sparks, and then Ulfrik was gone, darting past them both and out the shattered door into the shattered snow-covered clearing. By the time Sigurd and Solveig reached the doorway, Ulfrik was already mounting his black stallion, blood from his wounded thigh staining the snow beneath him crimson. He looked back at them once, his face now more shadow than substance, and smiled that terrible, inhuman smile. "The cave calls," he said, his voice carrying clearly despite the distance. "I will await you there, Wolfi. Bring the seer. Let us see whose vision of the future prevails." With that, he dug his heels into the stallion's flanks, and horse and rider disappeared into the forest, heading east, toward the mountain, toward the cave that had started it all.
Sigurd turned to Solveig, his expression grim. "You shouldn't have followed me," he said, though there was no real reproach in his voice, only concern. "If I hadn't, you would be dead," she pointed out practically. She reached up to touch the wound at his throat, her fingers coming away red. "You're bleeding." "Not just there," Sigurd acknowledged, becoming aware now of the various injuries he had sustained during the fight. The deep cut in his shoulder, a slash across his ribs, numerous smaller wounds that stung in the cold air. Solveig led him back into the lodge, where she quickly found cloths to bind the worst of his injuries. As she worked, Sigurd studied her face, noting the lingering glow in her eyes, an echo of the power she had channeled to drive Ulfrik away. "What was that?" he asked finally. "What you did?" Solveig's hands paused momentarily before resuming their task. "The old magic," she said simply. "The true Sair, not the corrupted version Ulfrik has embraced. My mother taught me before she died, but I didn't know if I could actually channel it." "It worked," Sigurd observed. "He feared you." "Not me," Solveig corrected, tying off the last bandage. "What I represent. The old ways, properly used, are anathema to the corruption he serves. Light against darkness, if you want the simple version." Sigurd absorbed this information, fitting it into his understanding of what they faced. "And now he goes to the cave," he said heavily, "where the darkness is strongest." Solveig nodded, her expression solemn. "He believes he can complete whatever transformation he's begun there, draw more fully on the power that has already changed him. And he may be right." She looked up, meeting Sigurd's eyes directly. "We have to follow him. We have to end this, or what happened to you and your friends, what's happening to Ulfrik, will spread like a disease."
The thought of returning to the cave, of facing not just the memory of what had happened there, but the very presence that had caused it, filled Sigurd with a dread so profound it was almost physical. And yet he knew Solveig was right. This had to end, one way or another. "How?" he asked simply. "How do we fight something like that?" Solveig touched the broken raven amulet at her throat, her expression determined. With this, with the old magic, and with your strength, Sigurd Wulfi, your resistance to the darkness that claimed your friends, and now claims Ulfrik. She didn't mention what they both knew, that Sigurd himself was not entirely free of that darkness, that the Berserker rage that served him in battle was itself a form of corruption, a shadow of the same influence that had transformed Ulfrik. It will be dangerous, Sigurd said, stating the obvious, because he needed to hear it spoken aloud. Not just from Ulfrik, but from whatever is in that cave. I know, Solveig replied quietly, but what choice do we have? If we flee, Ulfrik will only grow stronger. He'll return to his settlement, continue his work, spread the corruption to others, and eventually he'll find us. The truth of her words settled over Sigurd like a heavy cloak. There was no escape, no safe path forward, only the terrible necessity of returning to the place of his greatest shame and fear. Then we go to the cave, he said, his decision made. But first we need supplies, food, water, proper weapons. He looked around the devastated interior of the lodge. Ulfrik must have brought provisions, and his men left their weapons. They quickly gathered what they could find: dried meat, bread, a water skin, a bow and quiver of arrows left by one of Ulfrik's thanes. Sigurd took a sword from a rack on the wall to supplement his axe, testing its balance before strapping it to his back. Solveig found a small knife, similar to the one Sigurd had given her, but with a blade better suited for fighting than utility. As they prepared to leave, Sigurd paused, looking at Solveig with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Whatever happens at the cave," he said solemnly, "know that I do not regret finding you in the forest. If these are to be my last days, I am glad to have spent them in your company." The simple declaration, so at odds with Sigurd's usual taciturn nature, brought unexpected tears to Solveig's eyes. "Nor do I regret being found," she replied softly. "You saved more than my life, Sigurd Haraldsson. You reminded me that there are still good men in this world, worth fighting for." They stood for a moment in the wreckage of the lodge, two souls bound by circumstance and choice, facing a darkness neither fully understood, but both were determined to confront. Then, with a nod that conveyed more than words could have, Sigurd led the way outside, into the winter forest, toward the mountain where destiny and Ulfrik awaited them. The journey to the cave was arduous, made more difficult by Sigurd's injuries and the knowledge of what awaited them. They followed Ulfrik's trail, not difficult, given the blood that marked his passage through the snow, moving steadily eastward and upward toward the mountain ridge where the cave mouth yawned like an open wound in the rock face. As they climbed, the forest thinned, giving way to rocky terrain where the wind blew unchecked, carrying ice crystals that stung exposed skin. The sun, never strong in winter, began its early descent, casting long blue shadows across the snow. By the time they reached the approach to the cave, twilight had begun to settle over the land. Ulfrik's black stallion stood near the entrance, steam rising from its flanks, reins hanging loose. Of Ulfrik himself there was no sign, though fresh footprints in the snow led directly into the darkness of the cave. Sigurd paused, staring at the opening with a mixture of dread and grim determination. This place had haunted his dreams for 13 years, had shaped his life in ways he was only now beginning to understand. To return willingly seemed like madness, and yet he knew it was necessary. "He's gone inside," he said unnecessarily, his voice tight with tension.
To the inner chamber, no doubt. Solveig stood beside him, her face pale but resolute in the fading light. The passage you sealed, he would have reopened it? Sigurd nodded. The rocks I used were not large. With enough determination, they could be moved. He looked at her, concern evident in his expression. You don't have to come further. You could wait here, or better yet, return to the lodge. If I fail— I'm coming with you, Solveig interrupted firmly. Whatever waits in that cave, we face it together. My visions have shown me this much, at least. There was no arguing with the certainty in her voice. Sigurd accepted her decision with a nod, then turned back to the cave entrance. Stay close, he said, drawing his axe. The outer chamber should be safe enough. It's the inner one we need to be wary of. They entered the cave, the temperature dropping immediately as they moved beyond the reach of the dying daylight. Sigurd produced a small torch from his pack, taken from the lodge, and lit it, the flame casting dancing shadows on the rock walls. The familiar contours of the outer chamber emerged from darkness. The stone hearth where they had built their fire days before, the spring bubbling from the rock wall, the sleeping platform they had created from furs, all appeared undisturbed, except for a trail of blood droplets that led deeper into the cave, toward the back wall, where Sigurd knew the hidden passage lay. Following this grim trail, they soon reached the spot where, 13 years before, a young Sigurd had desperately piled rocks to seal away the horror he had witnessed.
Now, those rocks lay scattered, revealing a narrow opening barely wide enough for a man to pass through sideways. A soft, pulsing light emanated from beyond the passage. Not the warm yellow of firelight, but a cold, blue-green glow that seemed to throb in rhythm with a heartbeat. "He's in there," Sigurd said, his voice barely above a whisper. "And he's already begun whatever ritual he intends." Solveig touched the raven amulet at her throat, which had begun to emit a faint glow of its own. A warmer blue that somehow felt more natural, more right than the light from the inner chamber. "I can feel it," she said, her voice taking on that distant quality Sigurd had come to associate with her visions. "The boundary is thin here, as you said. The worlds overlap." Sigurd took a deep breath, steeling himself for what was to come. "Stay behind me," he instructed. "If anything happens to me, if I change, don't hesitate. Use your knife." The implication was clear. If the corruption that had taken Ulfrik began to affect Sigurd as well, Solveig should not risk herself trying to save him. She nodded, though her expression suggested she had no intention of following this particular instruction. With one final look at the woman who had, against all odds, become so important to him in such a short time, Sigurd turned to the passage and began to squeeze through, axe held awkwardly before him, the torch illuminating the narrow space. Solveig followed close behind, her smaller frame navigating the tight confines more easily. The passage was short, but seemed to stretch endlessly, each step taking them further from the natural world and closer to something ancient and wrong. The air grew thick, difficult to breathe, carrying a metallic taste that coated the tongue and burned the back of the throat. The walls themselves seemed to pulse with that strange blue-green light, veins of luminescence running through the rock like infected blood vessels. And then, suddenly, they were through, emerging into the inner chamber that had haunted Sigurd's nightmares for 13 years. It was both exactly as he remembered, and somehow more terrible.
a roughly circular space, perhaps 20 paces across, its walls embedded with that strange mineral that caught and reflected light in unnatural ways. In the center stood the stone altar, a flat slab of rock that rose from the floor like a malformed tooth. Upon this altar lay not the ancient preserved corpse Sigurd remembered, but Ulfrik Gudmundsson himself, spread-eagled, his arms and legs extending to the four corners of the slab. His chest was bare despite the cold, revealing intricate patterns carved into his flesh, fresh wounds that oozed blood in deliberate lines, forming symbols Sigurd did not recognize but instinctively knew were not meant for human understanding. Ulfrik's eyes were open but unseeing, rolled back to show only whites, and his mouth moved in a continuous chant, words in no language Sigurd had ever heard. The blue-green light pulsed from the walls in rhythm with this chant, growing stronger with each repetition, and with each pulse the blood from Ulfrik's self-inflicted wounds seemed to move, to flow not downward with gravity, but inward toward his heart. Most disturbing of all, shadows gathered above the altar. Not the natural darkness of the cave, but something more substantial, a roiling mass of blackness that seemed to be taking shape, responding to Ulfrik's chant and the patterns of his blood. "Gods preserve us," Sigurd breathed, the torch in his hand flickering as if in response to his fear. "What is he doing?" "Completing the transformation," Solveig replied, her voice steady despite the horror before them. "Offering himself as a vessel, a doorway between worlds." She stepped forward, the glow from her amulet intensifying as she moved closer to the altar. "We have to stop him, Sigurd, now, before the gateway opens fully." Her words broke the spell of shock that had momentarily paralyzed Sigurd. He moved forward, axe raised, intending to end Ulfrik's ritual in the most direct way possible, by ending Ulfrik himself. But as he approached the altar, the shadows above it coalesced suddenly, forming a barrier between Sigurd and the chanting chieftain. A voice, or something like a voice, emanated from this shadow, not heard with the ears, but felt in the mind. A pressure that threatened to overwhelm conscious thought. "You return, wolf-child. After so long, you return to us." Sigurd staggered under the mental assault, nearly dropping his axe. The voice was familiar, the same whispers he had heard 13 years ago, offering power, promising strength. But now it was stronger, more focused, as if Ulfrik's ritual had given it greater presence in the physical world. "I return to end this," Sigurd managed to say, forcing the words past the pressure in his mind. "To seal this place forever." "Seal?" the voice mocked. "You cannot seal what is already open. The gateway forms. The merging begins. Your friend understands this, accepts this. Why do you resist?" "Because I've seen what you offer," Sigurd replied, straightening with effort, his grip tightening on his axe. "Power built on corruption, strength that consumes rather than sustains. I want no part of it." The shadow seemed to pulse with something like amusement. "All power consumes, wolf-child. All strength demands sacrifice. Your friends learned this. Their essence feeds us still." The mention of his long-dead companions sent a surge of rage through Sigurd. Not the Berserker fury he had come to know in battle, but something cleaner, purer.
righteous anger, untainted by the corruption this entity offered. "You will not speak of them," he growled, advancing another step despite the pressure against his mind. "You will not use their memory." The shadow rippled, extending tendrils toward Sigurd like probing fingers. "Where is your rage, wolf child? The beautiful fury that served us so well? Have you buried it so deep?" "Not buried," Sigurd replied, continuing his advance. "Transformed, as all true strength must be." He glanced at Solveig, who had moved to the opposite side of the altar during this exchange. Her eyes met his briefly, conveying a silent message: keep the entity distracted. She had begun a ritual of her own, her hands moving in complex patterns, her lips forming words he couldn't hear, but could feel as a counterpoint to the pressure in his mind. The shadow seemed to sense this new threat, tendrils whipping toward Solveig with alarming speed. Without thinking, Sigurd threw himself forward, intercepting the dark extensions with his own body. The contact was like being plunged into ice water, a cold so profound it burned, seeping into his very bones. "The seer child thinks to challenge us?" The voice boomed in his mind, now tinged with something that might have been concern. "Her power is old, yes, but ours is older still, primal, eternal." Solveig continued her ritual, undeterred by the shadow's threat. The blue glow from her amulet had spread, forming a nimbus of light around her that seemed to repel the darkness. When she spoke, her voice carried the same layered quality it had in the lodge, as if multiple women spoke through her. "Older does not mean stronger," she said, her hands still weaving patterns in the air. "You are a fragment, a splinter of something once great, but now diminished. You feed on fear and rage because you have no substance of your own." The shadow recoiled from her words, as if physically struck. The pressure in Sigurd's mind lessened momentarily, allowing him to push forward, closer to the altar where Ulfrik continued his chant, oblivious to the confrontation around him. "Lies," the voice thundered. "We are eternal. We are power itself." "You are a parasite," Solveig countered, her voice growing stronger. "Older does not mean stronger," she said, her hands still weaving patterns in the air. "You are a fragment, a splinter of something once great, but now diminished. You feed on fear and rage because you have no substance of your own." The shadow recoiled from her words, as if physically struck. The pressure in Sigurd's mind lessened momentarily, allowing him to push forward, closer to the altar where Ulfrik continued his chant, oblivious to the confrontation around him. "Lies," the voice thundered. "We are eternal. We are power itself." "You are a parasite," Solveig countered, her voice growing stronger. "A memory of power, clinging to existence by feeding on the darkness in men's hearts. But there is light even in the darkest soul, and that light is poison to you." As she spoke, the blue glow from her amulet intensified, spreading outward in waves that pushed back the shadow wherever they touched. Sigurd, caught between this light and the retreating darkness, felt something stir within him, not the berserker rage, but something deeper, more fundamental. a recognition of his own essential nature, beyond the corruption that had touched him in this cave so long ago. "Sigurd," Solveig called, her voice cutting through the mental pressure. "The altar! Destroy it!" Understanding flashed through him. The altar was the focus, the physical anchor that allowed this entity to manifest in their world. With a roar that contained all the pent-up grief and rage of 13 years, Sigurd raised his axe and brought it down on the stone slab with all his strength. The blade struck with a sound like thunder, chips of stone flying outward from the impact. A crack appeared in the ancient rock, running from the point of impact toward where Ulfrik lay. The chieftain's chant faltered for the first time, his body convulsing as if in pain. "No!" the voice screamed in Sigurd's mind, the pressure returning tenfold, threatening to shatter his consciousness. "You cannot! The gateway opens!" Indeed, above the altar, the shadow had begun to take on a more definite shape, a swirling vortex that seemed to lead somewhere beyond the physical confines of the cave. Through this opening, Sigurd caught glimpses of a landscape that hurt his eyes to look upon, jagged formations under a sky the color of bruised flesh, movement that suggested living things, but of a form so alien they defied comprehension. Solveig's chant grew louder, more insistent, the blue light from her amulet pushing against the vortex, containing it, preventing it from expanding further.
But Sigurd could see the strain on her face, the trembling of her hands as she maintained this barrier against something vastly more powerful than herself. Again, she called to him, her voice strained. "Strike again, Sigurd. I cannot hold it much longer." Summoning his remaining strength, Sigurd raised his axe once more. But before he could bring it down, a hand shot out and grasped his wrist with inhuman strength. Ulfrik had risen partially from the altar, his eyes now open and fixed on Sigurd. But they were no longer human eyes. They were windows into the same alien landscape visible through the vortex, portals to a place no man was meant to see. "Too late, Wolf-Eye," Ulfrik said, his voice no longer his own, but a chorus of voices speaking in unison. "The gateway opens. The merging begins. What was separated will be joined once more." With strength that should have been impossible given his injuries, Ulfrik pulled Sigurd closer until their faces were inches apart. This close, Sigurd could see that the corruption had spread throughout Ulfrik's body, his veins standing out black against his skin, his features subtly distorted as if something pushed against them from within. "You could have been like me," Ulfrik said, the multiple voices separating and recombining in disturbing harmony. "Could have tasted true power. Instead, you cling to your humanity, your weakness." Sigurd struggled against Ulfrik's grip, but it was like being caught in a vice. "Better weak and human," he managed to say, "than strong and whatever you've become." Ulfrik laughed, the sound echoing strangely in the chamber. "What I've become is merely the beginning. When the gateway fully opens, when our worlds merge, all will know transformation. All will serve." With his free hand, Ulfrik reached for Sigurd's throat, fingers elongated into claw-like appendages that seemed designed for rending flesh. "But you, Wolf-Eye, will not live to see it. Your essence, like your friends before you, will feed the transition."
In that moment of mortal peril, something shifted within Sigurd. Not the berserker rage of battle, but something clearer, purer. A certainty that transcended fear or doubt. With a movement born of desperation and clarity combined, he released his axe, letting it fall to the stone floor with a clatter. Then, before Ulfrik could react, he reached up and grasped the wolf pendant that hung at his throat, ripping it free with a sharp tug. "My father's gift," he said, meeting Ulfrik's inhuman gaze directly. "Given in love, not fear. In strength, not weakness." And with that, he drove the iron pendant into Ulfrik's eye. Not the physical eye, but the portal that had replaced it, the window to that alien landscape. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. Ulfrik screamed, a sound that contained no trace of humanity, releasing Sigurd as he clutched at his face. The vortex above the altar pulsed erratically, the shadow tendrils whipping about in apparent agony. The pressure in Sigurd's mind increased to an almost unbearable level, then suddenly ceased, as if a door had been slammed shut. Solveig's voice rose in a final triumphant phrase, the blue light from her amulet expanding in a wave that engulfed the entire chamber. Where this light touched the shadow, it dissolved, not into darkness, but into nothingness, as if it had never been. Ulfrik convulsed on the altar, his body undergoing a terrible transformation, not towards the inhuman thing he had sought to become, but back toward humanity. The black veins receded, the distortions of his features smoothed away, leaving only a man, wounded, dying, but a man nonetheless. His remaining eye focused on Sigurd with surprising clarity. "You've destroyed everything," he said, his voice his own again, though weak and failing. "The gateway, the power." "I've saved you," Sigurd corrected gently, "from becoming something you were never meant to be."
Ulfrik's expression twisted with a complex mixture of emotions, rage, despair, and perhaps, at the very end, a flicker of gratitude. Then his eye glazed over, his body went limp, and Ulfrik Gudmundsson, chieftain of the eastern settlements, breathed his last. The blue-green light that had suffused the chamber faded, leaving only the warm blue glow of Solveig's amulet and the flickering yellow of Sigurd's torch, which had somehow remained lit throughout the confrontation. The oppressive atmosphere lifted, the air becoming simply the cool, damp air of a mountain cave rather than the charged miasma of moments before. Sigurd looked across the altar at Solveig, who stood with arms still outstretched, her face pale with exhaustion, but her eyes clear and fully her own. "Is it over?" he asked, hardly daring to believe it could be so simple after so much fear and pain. Solveig lowered her arms slowly, her shoulders sagging as tension left her body. "The gateway is closed," she confirmed, her voice once again her own, without the layered quality of the ritual. "The entity, whatever it was, has been driven back to its own realm, for now at least." "For now?" Sigurd repeated, concern evident in his tone. "Such things are never truly destroyed," Solveig explained, moving around the altar to stand beside him, careful not to touch Ulfrik's body. "Only contained, banished, weakened. But yes, the immediate danger has passed." Sigurd looked down at Ulfrik's corpse, feeling not triumph, but a complex mixture of pity and relief. "He thought he was claiming power," he said quietly. "In truth, it was claiming him." "As it nearly claimed you 13 years ago," Solveig observed. "The difference is that you recognized the corruption for what it was and rejected it.
Ulfrik embraced it, allowed it to consume him bit by bit until there was almost nothing human left. Sigurd retrieved his axe from the floor, then bent to pick up the wolf pendant that had fallen from Ulfrik's eye. The iron was blackened, as if it had been held in fire, but otherwise undamaged. "My father gave me this to protect me," he said, turning the pendant over in his hand. "I never understood until now what he meant by that." "Iron is anathema to entities from the other realms," Solveig explained. "Especially iron given in love, shaped with purpose. Your father knew more than perhaps you realized." This new understanding of his father's gift, and of the man himself, settled over Sigurd like a mantle. So much of his life had been shaped by that night in the cave, by the guilt and fear that followed. Now, standing in that same cave with Ulfrik's body before him and Solveig at his side, he felt something he had not experienced in 13 years. Peace. "We should leave this place," he said finally. "Seal it again, more permanently this time." Solveig nodded in agreement. "And Ulfrik?" Sigurd considered the body of his enemy, a man who had been corrupted, but who had, in his final moments, returned to humanity. "We'll take him with us," he decided. "Give him a proper burial. Whatever he became, he began as a man, and he ended as one." Together, they wrapped Ulfrik's body in his own cloak, then carried him through the narrow passage back to the outer chamber. There, they gathered their remaining supplies and prepared to leave the cave that had played such a pivotal role in both their lives. At the entrance, Sigurd paused, looking back into the darkness one final time. 13 years ago, I fled from this place in terror and shame," he said quietly. "Today, I leave it by choice, having faced what I feared most." Solveig slipped her hand into his, a simple gesture of connection that meant more than words could express. "And what awaits us now?" she asked, her green eyes reflecting the stars that had emerged in the night sky beyond the cave mouth.
Sigurd looked out at those stars, at the vast expanse of possibilities they represented. "A new beginning," he said simply, "for both of us if you wish it." Her answer was a smile that contained all the warmth the cave had lacked, all the humanity that Ulfrik had sacrificed in his pursuit of power. Hand in hand, they stepped out of the cave and into the clear winter night, leaving behind the darkness that had bound them, and moving toward a future neither could have imagined when their paths first crossed in a snow-covered forest. Behind them, unnoticed in the darkness of the cave, a single blue-green light flickered briefly in the depths of the inner chamber, then faded to nothing, dormant perhaps, but not destroyed, waiting, as such ancient things do, for the next traveler to stumble upon its secrets. But that would be another story, for another time. For now, in the star-lit snow, two souls who had faced the darkness together began the journey home, not to the places they had come from, but to whatever new place they might create together. And in that moment, between the fire and the ice, they understood that compassion could indeed be the strongest weapon a Viking could wield.
If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to subscribe. We're just getting started and we really need your support. And may the gods grant you a legendary life.